Thank you, Rajalakshmi ji. It's my privilege to be here to speak to the Indian community. Living in the United States, I've been going to other places too. I recall that in 1976, I spent almost 7 months of the 20-month emergency in the United States, campaigning against the emergency. Jayaprakash Narayan felt that since there's censorship in India, there's very little I could do in India, but that I could campaign abroad, and through the use of the international media, particularly the Voice of America and the BBC, we would be able to reach our people through the radio. In those days, the radio was the main communication medium, not like today, we have internet and cell phones and so on. Well, I must say that the role played by the Indians in the United States, Canada and England was so effective that it made a major contribution to the lifting of the emergency and the return of democracy. At the time when I came here, most Indians said, "What can we do sitting here? The action is in India." But the Indian community is not a nuclear community. It has links with its relatives and families back in India, and through them, the dissemination of true information took place. When I first came here, the impression was that the emergency was doing a lot of good. The trains were running on time, the officers were coming to office on time, and only criminals and smugglers and thieves were in jail. It's only after I came and then the propagation took place that there were 140,000 people, innocent people without trial in jail. People like Jayaprakash Narayan, Morarji Desai, all had been jailed. And slowly an atmosphere began to grow. Pressures grew on friendly governments also to speak to Mrs. Gandhi and ask how long is this going to continue. Well, ultimately Mrs. Gandhi had to buckle, and she held the elections thinking she would win it. But the silent majority of India, they spoke up, and Mrs. Gandhi herself lost the election in her own constituency, and a new party, which is the Janata Party, came to power, and democracy was restored. When I was campaigning, generally the Indians ask me questions which is very similar to the questions I'm being asked even today, which is, will this ever go? At that time the argument was, we are poor people in India. What do they understand about democracy and freedom, fundamental freedoms and so on? Their bellies are empty and they are more interested in filling that. And maybe India needs a dictatorship for some time. This is the kind of thing they would say. Then they would say, how is this ever going to go? Because there's no movement in India. You are campaigning here, but in India nobody is campaigning. Because there were no reports of the campaigning. There were no reports of any activity in India because there was censorship. So the people relying on newspapers took that stand. Today also, I find Indians telling me, how can we are all corrupt, everybody is corrupt. What is it that we can do? There's no difference between party A and party B. And so the same kind of hopelessness is being exhibited today as it was then, but it's a different kind of hopelessness. So I am today here to point out to you that many of these stories or the visions of gloom about India have been proved wrong. In 1947, when we became free, Churchill said that within 3 years, the Indians will come begging to us to return to India because they do not know how to rule. And they never have ruled. India was never one country. And there were only foreigners who came and put it together. Well, it didn't turn out to be true. It turned out to be false. Then, for a period of almost 40 years, we had a growth rate of 3.5% per year. And people said, well, India can't grow faster than this. We are incapable of growing fast. We are slovenly people, we are not hardworking people, all kinds of things. It just took one 6-month period to change all that in 1991. We brought economic reforms. The real reason why we are growing at such a slow rate was the model which Jawaharlal Nehru imposed on India, which is called the Soviet model. The Soviet model didn't succeed anywhere in the world. It didn't even succeed in the Soviet Union. In fact, all that you heard about the Soviet model was just propaganda. I remember when there was a crisis in the United States in the home and savings bank, home loans and savings account banks. They collapsed in 87, 86. It looked like a big crisis was around the corner. At that time, one of the most famous communists in India, Namboodiripad, told me that, see, capitalism is collapsing. Because many people thought that because I advocated free market, or rather market economy, I must be for America. But anyway, he said, see what's happening, capitalism is collapsing. So I said, what about Soviet Union? He said, in Soviet Union, there's no unemployment, there's no poverty, there's no inflation. I mean, it's almost like a heaven on earth. Well, I couldn't rebut it immediately. But in 1991, I went to Namboodiripad and said, now we can add a fourth. There's no Soviet Union also. It had broken into 16 countries. There's no Soviet Union today. And now people realize what a sham that the alleged development Soviet Union was. Germany was bombed and destroyed in 1945 and then partitioned into 2 countries. And one section went became West Germany. They adopted democracy, they adopted market economy. On the other side, East Germany adopted dictatorship and the Soviet model. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the two united, and then you saw. Now, nobody can say that East Germany had some less advantages than West Germany, because they were one country. They were equally destroyed. And then they were partitioned. The only difference between East Germany and West Germany was the economic model they had adopted. And we found the results, what a difference there was between the living standards of East Germany and West Germany. And you can find that today in North Korea and South Korea. Or China before economic reforms, China after economic reforms. For India, it just took 6 months to transform from a 3.5% growth rate to a 9% growth rate, just by deregulation. We haven't had, in fact, people thought we are permanently going to have 3.5% rate of growth, and they even nicknamed it as the Hindu rate of growth. It was not the Hindu rate of growth, it was the communist rate of growth. But still, people used to popularly say that. So I am telling you that if you go back in your past history, you will see all these stories of gloom about India, its future, and so on, are all misplaced. When in 1965, when we were almost begging for food from the Americans, 2 State Department officials called Paddock and Paddock, they wrote a book called World Famine 1975. And in that they said that, like the military, we have to distinguish between rescuable wounded soldiers and non-rescuable. That is, those who are maimed badly and are likely to die, they were left on the field, and only those who could be saved and brought back into fit shape, they were rescued. So they had this classification. So using that, they classified countries which should be rescued by United States providing food. And for India, this is in 1965, India, they said by 1975, India will be a bottomless pit, won't be able to feed itself, and even the whole world's food grains are deposited sent to India, there'll be not enough. So it's a waste of time. Let India rot in its own juice. And he said, they predicted, and they were State Department officials. You can go to Google and write paddock, and you'll get the reference. You can buy the book and read it for yourself. They said that in 1975, there will be food riots in India, people will eat each other up, etc., etc. Well, within 3 years of writing that book, India had Green Revolution. And by 1975, we were exporting food. Today, we don't know where to keep our food. In fact, many of the granaries are rotting because it's not proper arrangements have been made. So what happened? There's no one to be held accountable for that. But I remember when I was that time a young assistant professor at Harvard, I had a hell of a time convincing people that India is potentially in a position to feed itself. It can do it. What it lacks is technology. The same thing people said about India being a united country, it will break up. Pakistan used to say every day that India will break up, but in the end Pakistan broke up. Yugoslavia broke up into 4, Soviet Union broke up into 16, Indonesia has broken up into 2. But India, with all its problems, has not broken up. And if at all, it has been a slight increase in strength when we merged Sikkim into India. So India is a little bigger than it was before. But still, it's got a long way to go before it gets its original shape. But nevertheless, the fact is that all these predictions, dire predictions of India, have gone wrong. So today I begin by saying, please develop a positive attitude. Look in terms of what you can do and how you can do it. Rather than, no, nothing will happen. This usual argument of nothing will happen, everybody is the same, is a excuse for not doing nothing at all. And therefore, you must now develop a new mindset. And today I'm on the subject of the mindset. Because the mindset today in this modern world of instant communications is the most important thing. So in no time people can reduce you to a pulp just by developing a negative mindset. Why I say mindset is important is that sometimes we think we are 120 million, 1 billion to 1.2 billion people. How can we be put down? Or they think that numbers are very important for us. Numbers are not enough without an accompanying mindset. I've said it in many of my lectures and I would like to repeat it again. You can have 1,000 goats in one place. If one tiger comes, the numbers are with the goats, but it will be the goats which will run away, not the tiger. In fact, the tiger will chase them and get his lunch for the day. So, therefore, it's not numbers that matter. Similarly, strength alone doesn't matter. You can see 5 well-fed, strong lions in a cage in a circus, and a thin, wiry ringmaster entering that cage, shutting it, and then ordering these lions to climb up a bench. They'll all climb up the bench. Then he will say, open your mouth, and they'll all open their mouth, and he'll put his head in each one of them. Question is, why don't these lions just snap this man's head off or kill him? They are in a position, they had the strength. But because from the time they were cubs, they were brought up to obey. So his mind has been prepared to obey. So when he says climb up, they climb up. And we see this, a translation of this in our real life too. Today many people ask me, Manmohan Singh is sitting in the Prime Minister's chair. He has so much power. Why does he submit like this? Why is he so ineffective? Why is he so silent? Well, that's the way he has been brought up. In fact, his name is also Singh, which means lion. He's a circus Singh in that sense. And he just has been all his life obeying. And therefore he obeys. He doesn't understand the power of the chair. So I don't blame him. That's his upbringing. What I would like to see is that our future generations are not brought up that way. They are assertive, they are risk takers, they will stand up for their rights and fight without hesitation. Now, I would say that the first step for Hindus to develop unity, both in this country and in India, is to get rid of certain divisions which have become out of date. One of the most debilitating division is that of the caste or the Varna. Originally, when the Varna was designed, it had a purpose different from what it is being used today. There's nothing racial about the Varna, as when the Britishers tried to make out. In fact, they said that the Varna means color, and the color of Brahmin was white and the color of the Shudra was black. So they said this is, part of the racial thing. But then when you look at the color of the Kshatriya, it is saffron. Now we don't have saffron color in our face. And that of the Vaishya is green. So it was just a kind of a marking as a kind of a label. Furthermore, now the latest studies on DNA show that there's no racial difference between any Indian, right from Kanyakumari to Kashmir. Don't please go by this complexion argument, because complexion has got nothing to do with the race. Complexion is a pigmentation, the effect of the sun on the pigmentation of your skin, under your skin. And this has been proved by Michael Jackson, the singer, who went to a plastic surgeon and said, please remove my pigmentation. And then his color became like that of a European, as white as a European. Skin color has nothing to do with race. This is a wrong impression that has been created. What determines race is the DNA structure of your blood. Your DNA structure can also be ascertained by scrapes of your skin, samples of your hair, and so on. And that is published research, both in this country, in the University of Houston, in India, in the University of Mysore, and several other places, and in Cambridge, in the Cambridge Journal of Genetics. And what does it say? That the DNA of all Indians are the same. And that explodes the theory that we are two communities, Aryans and Dravidians. That India was once all Dravidian, then the Aryans came through the Khyber Pass, attacked the Dravidians and drove them to the south. It's total nonsense. There's no basis at all. In fact, the word Aryan doesn't exist in any of our literature or of our scriptures. Arya exists. Arya means a gentleman. In Tamil we say Ayya, and in North India it is Arya. And Arya has nothing to do with race. Similarly, Dravida has nothing to do with race. The first time ever the word Dravida was used was by Adi Shankara, when he went around the country in challenging other schools of thought, particularly the Buddhist school of thought, to a debate. And the Indian system was never convert people by the sword. You argue, you have a debate. If you lose the debate, you convert to his religion. And if he loses, he converts to your religion. So Shankara went on winning, and Buddhism went into reverse, into decline, and Hinduism returned. And there were some other schools like the Uttaramimsa school, for which the biggest spokesman was Mandana Mishra. And he was in Bihar. Adi Shankara went all the way there and challenged him to a debate. And in the debate, the first question Mandara Mishra asked him is, "Who are you?" He said, "I am Dravida Shishu." And Shishu, of course, means child. But Dravida, I am told by scholars, what Shankara meant is a sandhi of two words, Tra and Vid, which means where the three oceans meet or the three coastlines meet, which means South India. That's all Dravida meant. And this was extolled into, the British made it into a great nation and so on, and created a movement also called Dravida movement, which is today, after much splintering, is in the form of, in political power, in the form of DMK and ADMK. And this whole idea was to split India. That was the intention of the British. And that's how it came. And all kinds of crazy concepts were there. For years, Karunanidhi used to celebrate Ravan Leela, because North India was celebrating Ram Leela. So he said, no, Ravan is from Sri Lanka, he's our man. He's a Tamil. He was not a Tamil, but he said he's a Tamil. He's a Dravidian, because he's one of us. But actually the truth, if you examine, Ravan was not from Sri Lanka. He was actually born beyond the borders of Delhi in what is now called as Noida. That's where Ravan was born. And his wife Mandodari was born in Meerut. Karunanidhi didn't know this. Moreover, Karunanidhi didn't know that Ravan was a Brahmin. Very few people knew that he was a Brahmin. And he was a great Pandit of Samaveda. And after his birth and education, he went to Mansarovar. I, of course, had the privilege of going there for the first, as the first person after 35 years, after the Chinese had shut it down and closed it. And now every year thousands of people go because of the arrangement between India and China, Tibet being now considered as part of China. So I went as the first traveler to Mansarovar, and on the way to Mansarovar, I thought I had already reached Mansarovar, and I saw a huge lake. And I said, have we reached Mansarovar? I asked my guides. And they said, no, this is not Mansarovar, this is Ravan Haranga. So I said, what do you mean by Ravan Haranga? They said, well, Haranga in Tibetan means sarovar or lake. But Ravan was somebody from India. We don't know anything much about him. So I said, okay, then before going to Mansarovar, let me have a bath here. They said, no, don't have a bath here. Because if you have a bath here, then you will get itches on your skin. So I said, what about drinking a sip of that water? He said, no, if you drink a sip of that water, then you will get terrible stomach aches. You may even die. So finally I took a bottle of that water. When I returned to India, I gave it to Karunanidhi and said, prove your loyalty to Ravan by drinking this water. Now, I'm saying that Ravan, after getting a boon from Lord Shiva, and Lord Shiva, you know, is always a soft touch, and that's why he's called Bholanath. And he gave him a powerful boon by which he could conquer anybody. And he came and he saw that in his distant relative, Kuber was ruling Sri Lanka. And he captured it and took over and declared it a mistake. That's how Ravan went there. But these people didn't know that. And for years this was being stated. Similarly, in Maharashtra, we had this Raj Thakre movement, which said that all these UP walas are all non-Marathis. And, you know, they're snatching the jobs of Marathis. I managed to get the hair sample of Raj Thakre and of a UP taxiwala, and I had it tested, and I found that they're the same DNA. In fact, I publicly announced that Raj Thakre is also from UP because his DNA shows that he's the same as the UP wala. And since then, I have not seen Raj Thakre repeat this UP taxiwala business as being an outsider. So all these things put together, what I am trying to say is that this division is a very, very pernicious division which has come over now almost 200 years, of British rule, and they have changed the textbooks. They made you forget Sanskrit, and they replaced it with English. And through the English medium, they were able to transmit in language with effortless ease. And as a consequence, today we have this feeling of division, that we are not one people. Varna is by no means a division based on race. In fact, it is not even based on birth. If you go to the Gita, you can see that. Varna has nothing to do with birth. Varna is a decentralization of power. It's a concept of decentralization. Because when two rishis, great rishis met, Bhrigu and Bhardwaj, they discussed this question, how to construct society which is stable. And they came to the conclusion or rather Bhrigu proposed that the only way that can be done is identify the sources of power, which he identified as 4. Knowledge, weapons, then wealth and land. And he said that these should be decentralized. And no person should have more than one of this. And that's how the concept came that those who pursue knowledge, they will not have weapons, they will not have wealth, they will not have land. And the concept of a poor Brahmin arose, but they also said that because of this sacrifice, the Brahmin would be the highest, the apex of the society. And to be a Brahmin, you had to follow the discipline. Otherwise, you can't be a Brahmin. And if you follow this discipline, doesn't matter where you were born, you would become a Brahmin or a rishi. So Vedavyasa, whose mother was a fisherwoman and who wrote the Mahabharata, he became a Maharishi. Now, how could he become a Maharishi if his mother was a fisherwoman? Similarly, Kalidas, he was a hunter. In fact, he used to cut wood, cut off the branches of trees. This was his work. And suddenly, because of circumstances, he suddenly rose to be a Maharishi and a great poet. Then Valmiki, who wrote the Ramayana, he was born in Dalit family. He was born in a family which was, declared as untouchable in that period. And children of untouchables are not untouchables. They were, Valmiki is an example of that. So Valmiki also became Maharishi. The Rishi of Rishis, the biggest Rishi we have had, is Vishwamitra. And Vishwamitra was born in a Kshatriya family. So therefore, this had nothing to do with birth. And it's a question of the karma that you do that determined your varna. But unfortunately, over the years, it has got fossilized into birth. And today, I believe the time has come for us to give it up altogether, because it's meaningless. I met Brahmins who are businessmen. No, that's not a Brahmin. There's nothing wrong with being called a Vaishya, nothing wrong to be called a Kshatriya. But those persons still continue to call themselves saying, I'm a Brahmin. And that must go. I think this whole Varna system has become so out of date, fossilized, that there's no way to reform it. So we must, as a first step for unity of our country, we must give up this. It may take time, but we must give it up and start thinking of ourselves as Hindus. This is the first step that has to come. And if there's any inter-Varna marriage, there should be no opposition to it. Because in the end, ultimately, your idea is to have more Hindus in this world. The other aspect of this is, people sometimes ask me that if you talk about uniting Hindus, what about Muslims and Christians? There I say that again the Muslim and Christian DNA is the same. There's no difference between them and the Hindus. And that also there are research studies on that. So what you should require is that the Muslim should recognize that his ancestors were Hindus. And therefore, he is, and he voluntarily accepts that and he's proud of it. If he does that, then he becomes part of the family. Now, that's not an easy thing to do because the mullahs and the clerics, they don't want this to happen. In 1857, when the Muslims and the Hindus fought together, the British then, after achieving their victory, made it a policy to create a distance. It was called then the theory of distance. And they got a Delhi cleric from Jama Masjid to propagate this, that the Muslims are actually children of Gori and Ghazni and from Pathans and this and that. Well, unfortunately, now modern science has disproved it. So we must now start asking the Muslim that you accept this fact. Well, privately many do. Once Farooq Abdullah told me, I am very proud to tell you that my ancestors are Gaud Saraswat Brahmins. So I told him, why don't you say this publicly? He said, are you mad? The mullah will kill me if I say that. So the bringing of the integration of the Muslim and the Hindu community into a broader concept from Hindus to become Hindustanis, this is what we need, the acknowledgement of the truth. So I would say, first of all, Hinduism is such a broad concept that anybody can be a Hindu. If he says, I'm a Hindu, he may be a white person living in United States or a black person living in Africa. If he says, I'm a Hindu, there's nobody who can say, no, you can't be a Hindu. Hindu is so inclusive, and this has been clearly stated by Vivekananda a number of times. So I would say that we must now develop this concept of unity by consciously fostering this idea that we are one people, and give up these appellates of your varna, which is now out of date because you don't follow yes, of course you can still continue with it by following the discipline of the varna. For instance, if you are a Kshatriya, you can certainly be a king, you can be a ruler, but you can't make policy. Unlike in Europe, the monarch used to make the policy. He used to decide who will get death sentence, who will not get death sentence. But in the Indian Hindu scheme, the king had to go and ask for sanction of his policy from the Brahmin. And once he certified it, or when he gave sanction, then you could implement it. It was a different system. I was not in a monarchy in the traditional sense of the word. There was somebody above the monarch, and that was the learned people of the society. So we need to foster it, and I think in the United States particularly, you can do this also. And I'll explain to you why your unity is important and how it can be translated into the greater good. It's not that it's some new idea, because the Christians are internationally united, the Muslims are even more united. In fact, in India, once a Muslim intellectual told me, why do you support Israel so much? I said, why not? They are giving us weapons, they are giving us knowledge of, they are giving us know-how, they are helping us in a number of ways. And why shouldn't we? And we have no conflict with them. They don't have a common border with us. He said, no, but they are killing the Palestinians. Well, if they are killing the Palestinians, that's between them and the Palestinians, and a part of the United Nations problem. But why should I decide my friendship with Israel on the basis that they were killing Palestinians? And that's because the Muslim psychology has been internationalized. He sees this himself as a part of the international community. And for him, being an Indian is a technicality. And that is what I would like him to overcome by acknowledging that his ancestors are Hindus. So this would be the first step, I would say, that we recognize our identity. Let me say that there's something, let us know this, that it's our identity as a Hindu which has kept us today as a continuing civilization. At the last count, there were 46 civilizations the world has ever known. 45 have disappeared. There's only one continuing civilization today, and that is the Hindu civilization. The Greeks are not a continuing civilization. The Egyptians are not a continuing civilization. The Romans are not a continuing civilization. India is a continuing Hindu civilization. Of that, there are no two questions about it. And how did this happen? It happened at a great price, at a great cost. It was, in fact, I never realized how the Hindus, our ancestors, the Hindus, fought to keep the Hindu civilization going. I had a student from Saudi Arabia at Harvard who once asked me whether he could ask me a question after class. And after class, when I met him, he told me that in his university back home, there's a research going on as to why India is still 80% plus Hindu. So I said, I don't find that, I'm not able to comprehend. What do you mean by that? He said, you see, India had, the Islam went to Iran, where the Zoroastrians were ruling, and conquered it, and within 15 years converted Iran into 100% Muslim. In the neighboring countries of Mesopotamia and Babylon, which are now together known as Iraq, they captured it and converted it by the usual methods known to Islam, namely, you convert or you die. On that basis, they converted Iraq into 100% Muslim within 17 years. Egypt was converted to 100% Muslim in 21 years. The Christians went to Europe. In 50 years, they made it 100% Christian. But in India, 800 years rule of Islam and 200 years rule of Christianity through the British, and still you are 80%. So what is the secret? Now, when I told him I'll need some time to think about this, because it's a new question for me, and I went back and thought and went through the research, and I found that Indians, contrary to the popular impression, the Hindus kept on fighting right to the end. But it was sporadic in the sense it was not a national rebellion. And in any case, the Mughals were not national in that sense. They were also only a sectional part of India. And the fight was such that even if any king fighting the Mughals lost, the society still venerated him. And the best example is that of Rana Pratap. He lost everything and went and hid in a forest. And there he was surviving by taking grass and turning it into, drying it, and then making a paste of it, and then making a chapati of it. That's how he was surviving when his cousin from Jaipur, who had become a part of the entourage of Akbar, he came to see him and said, my brother, Akbar has sent me to you. He says that if you accept him as the Badshah of India, the Emperor of India, he will return everything to you, like he has done with me. I have accepted him and he has now returned Jaipur to me. So Rana Pratap said, no, I can't do that. I will not agree that Akbar is the Emperor of India. It's all by force and something that I will not accede to. So Jaipur Raja Man Singh said, what are you going to do all your life? You're going to be eating this chapati made out of grass? What will you get out of it? He said, what I'll get out of it is this, that future generation of women will name their sons after me, but on your name they'll spit. That's enough for me. That's what he said. And you find all over India, we don't distinguish very much in whom we hero worship between losers and winners, provided they have exhibited courage. For example, Rani Jhansi, she also lost, but she is venerated. Subhash Chandra Bose lost, he is venerated. In Tamil Nadu, Katta Bomman is there. He was hanged in the middle of Tirunelveli streets by the British. He is venerated. In Karnataka, Rani Chennamma. So, I mean, you will find people struggle. Some succeeded. For example, the Vijayanagaram Empire lasted 300 years and covered more territory than the Mughals. But our history books don't reflect that. It will be only one small paragraph that in South India there was a Vijayanagara Empire. Now, but on the other hand, from Akbar to Aurangzeb is only 150 years. And there's one chapter for each Mughal emperor. And that's how the history has been distorted. And this has been one of our banes which divides our country. So we have to now rewrite our history. And for rewriting our history, we must record both negative and positive aspects. But the fact is that this was the civilization of one people, and that one people did not submit to oppression. They fought it right through the end. And now we have to find a new kind of oppression, which I'll come to you in a moment. But I think that means that not only in our unity, not only we must accept all of ourselves as one, DNA-wise, but we should also know our true history. What is our true history? A big project is going on. Some of them are doing it here, like Rajiv Malhotra in Princeton. Some of us are working in India, and I'm certainly sure that when a new government comes, we will have a commission to write new textbooks for the true history of India, which reflects what is correct. And it's a glorious history. Though, we were the richest country till 1200 AD. And even up till 1700, we and the Chinese together constituted 50% of the world GDP. But unfortunately, the Industrial Revolution, technological change could not be brought into India. The British prevented it in India, and in China, the emperors prevented it, and that's why the Industrial Revolution didn't take place in India, and both China and India fell back. So, I think these are some of the things that need to be recorded. Look at what visitors from abroad said about India. Faxian, the Chinese Buddhist monk, Yuan Chuang, Vasco da Gama, Mark Twain, all these people, they are in raptures about the Indian and the Indian people. Faxian says, India is certainly the most developed country in the world, much more than China. But what strikes me about India is the sheer honesty of the people there. I mean, something I can't believe that we were those Indians, descendants of those Indians. He says that nobody closes their doors when they go out in the night. And if you go to the house and leave anything there, they will chase you till they find you and give it back to you. So, this honesty, this development in science, arts, medicine, these are all over. And in fact, we are so developed and the rest of the world was so behind that I very often mention in my lectures what I see at Harvard University. There's in the suburb of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is an area called Belmont, where there's a huge lake. And that lake is called Belmont, Fresh Pond Lake. And there is on the edge of that lake is a signboard which says, here stood Tudor Ice Company, which exported rice to India. Exported rice, not rice, but ice to India. So I was a bit surprised how, from America in 1636, you would be exporting ice. So I went back to Google and checked whether there's something called Tudor Ice Company. And I found indeed there was. And I got the book, and the book says that merchants from Salem, Massachusetts used to go to India, that is South India, to Kanchipuram to be exact, and they used to load cloth, spices, all kinds of things from India and come back. And one day the king called them to ask whether he could do anything for them to make them more comfortable. And they said, yes, one thing you can do. We come with empty ships and buy goods here and go back. So why don't you buy something from us? So the king said, what can I buy from you? India produces everything. They said, no, something you can buy. So he said, I have never seen ice in my life. I know that it is there in the Himalayas, but I have to go a long distance to see it. But in your country, I hear that it falls from the sky. I presume he meant the snowfall. Therefore, if you bring ice, I will buy it. Because I have never seen it, I want to, have it around here. So when the winter, this lake freezes, these merchants then sliced up the lake, put a sawdust on it, and took it all the way to India. And the first export from the United States to India was ice. And that was the difference between India and the United States in those days. Can one imagine today what a transformation has taken place? So I would say that therefore we need this question very, very clearly. We have to understand our history. But we also have to understand the threats to our civilization that is coming place. And we have to have a united response to it. In private conversation, everybody talks to me about Muslims and the danger they pose and so on. Well, I suppose they are looking at this terrorism all over the world, and they are not ready like other people to make a distinction. And they generally say in a generic term, the Muslims are terrorists, etc. But the fact is, you see, the problem with Muslims is not their terrorism. It's their religion is so clear-cut. And in a sense, we should admire it because they know their mind. We Hindus are the people who don't know their mind. It's like Arjuna sitting in the middle of Mahabharata, in Kurukshetra, saying, shall I kill my brother, shall I not kill my brother? Or when Karna was down repairing his chariot, and he said, shall I kill him now? Is it proper for a Kshatriya to kill him? Krishna had to tell him each time that he has to do it. So this nagging doubts, the Indians have all kinds of nagging doubts. Whereas the Muslim is very clear-minded. And Muhammad told them the world is in three parts. And the Muslim behavior must be different for each of those parts. First part, he said, is Darul Islam. Darul Islam is where the Muslims are in power. They are in majority, they are in power. And he says there should be no allowance, accommodation for any other religion. So either they must convert or be killed. It's as specific as that in the Sirah and Hadith. So in most of these countries where the Muslims are in power, you can see a total intolerance to the minorities. In Saudi Arabia, we have so many Hindu workers there. Can they celebrate Diwali in Saudi Arabia? No. Can they build a Hindu temple like you are able to build here in the United States? No. Can you even carry the picture of Ramchandra ji in your pocket when you go to work? No. And there are penal offenses if you do it. You can't even have Satyanarayana Puja inside your own house. Now, this is the position of Muslims when they are in majority. When they are in minority, as in India, they are demanding mosques, they are demanding their right to read namaz, the Friday holiday, etc. It's a separate code for marriage, and so on. So what the Muslims demand as a minority, they will not accept to give when they are in the majority. So that's you may not like this point of view, but there's clarity in that mind. And so Muhammad says that when you are in majority, you are not to tolerate any other religion. You must wipe it out. Second is that where the Muslims are not in majority, there Muhammad divided the world into two parts. And that is, first part is, which he called as Darul Harab. Darul Harab is where the Muslims are in a sizable minority, and the majority is divided. The majority is confused, like we are today, like we Hindus are today. There, Muhammad says that the job of the Muslims is to go on demanding more and more concessions by acting collectively and ultimately reach a point where they are able to transform that the society into a Darul Islam, from Darul Harb to Darul Islam. So when you look at the laboratory experimentation of this, selecting, looking for evidence, you see this very clearly. Take Kashmir. Kashmir is, the valley at least is a majority Muslim area. See what has happened to the minorities there. 500,000 Kashmiri Pandits have been driven out. All the temples have been destroyed to the extent that they can, where it's not protected by central police. And Hindus have hardly any rights. They are discriminated against, they are threatened. In Pakistan, it's very difficult to remain a Muslim. There are a few Muslims there, maybe a few Hindus, or like about 50,000 or so. Some say 500,000, but I don't know. But those who come from there tell horrible stories of what happens to them. In Bangladesh, in 1947, there were 32% of the population were Hindus. Today it's only 7%. Nobody talks about it. You see, they talk about Gujarat every day, but they will not talk about what's happening in Bangladesh. And it's not only states and countries. Even districts you will see this. If you go to, say, Mau in Uttar Pradesh, you can see it. Even why we go to Kerala, in Malappuram, the Hindus are living there in utter fear. And they invited me recently to address a meeting, and I did go. And there I found that even though there's no such provision for such a law, and it's illegal to advocate it, Muslims have laid down a rule there that if any Hindu wants to sell a property in Malappuram, he has to sell it to another Muslim. So this is, you can see in a district. Even smaller you go down to Tamil Nadu. Total population of Muslims in Tamil Nadu is 5%. In one area near Vellore, it's called Mel Visharam, there is a town panchayat. In the town panchayat, there is 75% Muslim. And the local bodies election, they come to power in the administration of that town panchayat. And they will not give any amenities of the town panchayat to these Hindu areas until they agree to convert. So they make it a condition. You convert, we'll give it to you. Otherwise, not give you. I went there and I saw myself what was happening. So I went to the court and got a court order. And now, of course, the matter is rectified. But I can't do this on a micro basis. I did it as an example, but this is what's happening. This is the mindset of the Muslim. And finally, Muhammad says, if you are in a minority and the majority is united, then Muhammad says, surrender and don't argue with the minority. And that's what we see in countries where the majority is united. Australia, one day, Imam said that, I can't, it's intolerable to have a uniform civil code with the Christians in Australia. We need our own Sharia. And I appealed to the Prime Minister to give us Sharia. So Prime Minister was a lady, the next day said, if you want Sharia, my recommendation to you is to go and find another country, because in Australia, we are not going to give you a separate code. You will have only a uniform civil code. Now, immediately the following day, all the Muslim organizations passed a resolution saying that this Imam is an idiot or is an imbecile, he doesn't represent us. We are very happy with uniform civil code. So in Australia, the Muslims will accept uniform civil code, but not in India. And this, in the United States also, you can't have a separate, although there are heavy efforts going on. So, where the majority is united, the Muslim population is advised by Sirah and Hadith to cooperate, collaborate, capitulate to the majority. And I think there's a lesson for us in that unity. What is the problem today in India? There are all the time accusation that politicians are, appeasing the minority, they are appeasing them to get votes, it's vote bank politics, so on. Well, I have talked to those politicians like Mulayam Singh, and I told him, what is this that you're doing? So he said, well, I can't get elected unless the Muslims vote for me. Because the Hindus will only vote, only Yadavas will vote for me. Others will not vote for me. So therefore I have to appease them. And the day the Hindus vote as one block, that day I will put on a tikka and say, Jai Shri Ram, and come out of my house. Because I am interested in getting vote, and this is the way to get it. And I am telling you today that all this appeasement talk that you people are condemning, I see people condemning politicians for that. I am telling you that the day the Hindus will unite, all these politicians will change around, and they will start talking in terms of Hindus and what should be done for them. We are 80% or 80 plus, even today. And if of this half the population decides to vote for a party which stands for Hindus, that party will get more than majority of the seats. Majority is 272, but according to my calculation, you'll get 320 seats in the 544-member House of Parliament. So how is the Muslim responsible for our plight? It is we, for lack of unity, for lack of ability to vote, at least once, twice, as Hindus, and say that we, for the sake of protection of our civilization, we are going to vote for a party which will work for our interests. Certainly that party cannot be Congress, because the Congress today has been taken over by Sonia Gandhi, who is answerable only to the Vatican, and she promotes Christian missionary activity. We are not against Christians. Christians can propagate as much as they like in India, but we don't want foreign missionaries to come here to India and poke their noses into our internal affairs. But she abets them, she brings them, so obviously voting for them is useless. The only grouping which can possibly work for Hindu interests would be the NDA, and there, of course, I'm hard at work. Certainly I can tell you, if both Modi and myself get together inside I'm already there, but in terms of decision making, there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that Hindu interests will not suffer. Now, there are a few things that need to be done to foster this concept of minor. One is, I have advocated in India and I'll advocate here too. Please don't have temples only for worship. Make temple a core of a campus where you teach yoga, you teach Sanskrit, you teach Gita, so on and so forth, and make it as a place where you can come, where young people can come. Our young people need to be educated not in this doctrinaire way, because they will not accept it, but in terms of in the totality of the thing. Yoga today is a most acceptable part of, to the Western world. It's certainly acceptable, even though it's a core part of the Hindu tradition. Sanskrit learning, if you ask me, there's one thing that you as NRIs can do to become united Hindus. I would say the one thing you can do is either you or your children, and if you are much older, then your grandchildren, are motivated to learn Sanskrit. You can't just tell them learn Sanskrit, but you motivate them by telling them see what the NASA has done. NASA has done research for years on what language to store knowledge in the computer. This is the field of artificial intelligence. And you can Google it and find out. Write just NASA in Sanskrit, it will come out. They found ultimately that the only language which is computer compliant for storing of knowledge is Sanskrit with Devanagari script, and they have now made it a requirement to learn that language before you study artificial intelligence in NASA. And I'm telling you that in Britain today, in many schools they are teaching Sanskrit because they say the recital of slokas in Sanskrit itself generates vibrations in your body which leads to much clearer thinking. You can again Google it and find out these. There have been a number of news items that have come that way. So, all said and done, I would say that if we speak one language, English maybe, as Raja Lakshmi just now said, that it's the only medium of communication. Well, it's a temporary factor. The way we are murdering English, I don't think English is going to last very long. But I think Sanskrit will ultimately, once again, become the medium of communications, because every Indian language has Sanskrit vocabulary. Malayalam has 90% Sanskrit. Tamil has 40% Sanskrit. Kannada has 60% Sanskrit. So all languages have Sanskrit words. And even the worst opponent of Sanskrit and Hindu culture and so on, like Karunanidhi, he has not changed his name. It's Karuna and Nidhi. They are both Sanskrit words. I've asked him many times, why don't he change it? But he keeps, and his children and grandchildren, they also have Sanskrit names. Aditya and things like that. So, well, Stalin is not even a English name, it's a Russian name. He named it, he told me when Stalin was at the height of his power. And I think it's appropriate that he should be called Stalin. I don't want him to be called Aditya. So anyway, I would say that, this is a uniting factor, and you here don't have to, you're not required to learn in great detail. You'll be able to speak your mother tongue is one thing. But the language which you will find in the future, which is going to be the language of the future, is going to be Sanskrit. And this is one commitment you can have. Ask these temples and so on to have Sanskrit teachers. And nowadays, I've seen these tape recordings and videos and so on. They make it very easy to learn Sanskrit. And once you start having Sanskrit lunch tables and so on, it will grow. And then you motivate your children by connecting it to the computer and the other aspects. One last thing I would like to say, that all this is worth doing only if you make a commitment to defend it, this tradition. And that is the question that we have to ask ourselves. In 1999, when the Indian Airlines aeroplane was hijacked to Kandahar, large numbers of people came on the street to demonstrate, release, agree to any condition, but bring our passengers back, bring our family members back safely. Now, that's not a way that you should have. Of course, I had urged that time the government to, because the hijackers really wanted the release of one person, and namely Azhar, Muhammad Azhar. He's a cleric, and now he runs Jaish-e-Mohammed. I think we saved 159 passengers of Indian Airlines, but he has killed 3,000 Indians since then. I had suggested that the only way to do it is to say that if you don't release the plane, we'll kill him, we'll execute him. And I was sure, knowing that yes, this would what they would do. They would release the plane. They couldn't afford him to be executed. I myself was a minister in 1991 when one of the Kashmir National Conference leaders, and now part of the Congress, called Saifuddin Soz. His daughter was kidnapped, and the terrorists wanted 3 of their colleagues in jail to be released. Now, earlier on, the previous government of VP Singh, Mufti Muhammad Said's daughter was kidnapped, and they surrendered and released 5 dangerous terrorists. But when it came to us, the Prime Minister asked me to look at it and see what could be done without risking the life of the girl. So I did consult with some important experts around the world, particularly the Israelis, and I came to the conclusion that the kidnappers were JKLF people. And their main office bearers were living in Birmingham, Leicester, and London. So with the help of with the Israelis, I won't mention at what level, we met these, had our people went and met these terrorist office bearers in exile in London, and he said, if this girl is not released within the next 48 hours, then I am afraid you people will not be on this earth. You will be dispatched, that you will be killed. And we also told them that please don't waste your time complaining or registering a protest to the British police, because we have enough sources in the British government to see that we get our way. The consequence of that was that instead of 48 hours time which we gave, in 24 hours the terrorists put the girl in an auto rickshaw and took her to Saifuddin Soz's house and released her, without our releasing anybody. So this retaliation is a very important thing. Kashmiri Pandits, 5 lakhs have been driven to India. Now what do? You can't ask them to go back. Even if the Farooq Abdullah or Umar Abdullah says, no, please come back, nobody's going to go, because they'll be butchered, killed, and so on. When Umar Abdullah is having problems of his own security, how can he give security to 5 lakhs Kashmiri Pandits? So I have suggested, and I hope if I am in a position to implement it, I'll implement it, that since they have driven out 5 lakh Kashmiri Pandits, we should select 10 lakh ex-servicemen from the 1 crore ex-servicemen we have. Most of them retire quite young, in our army and so on, and are really still fighting fit. 10 lakhs of them, and give them weapons and money and say, please go and settle down in Kashmir, so that we can restore our population, religious population ratio once again. And if those people go and settle down there, and then over a period of time they would create an atmosphere in which the Kashmiri Pandits can come back. Now this is a retaliation. Similarly, Bangladesh has sent 1/3 of its population, Muslim population, to India. And they have now, many districts have been converted into Muslim majority districts in Assam. So we have been trying heroically to catch them and then sending them across, and then they come back and bribe the border security force and come back again, because economic conditions are much better in India than in Bangladesh. So the only solution is, in my opinion, to retaliate, which is by telling Bangladesh that Pakistan was created because there were Muslims who could not bear to live with Hindus. And therefore British said we have to give them separate territory. And out of that came, of course, Bangladesh. So we tell Bangladesh, if after getting Bangladesh, your Muslims are ready to come and live in India with the Hindus, then what is the meaning of that basis on which Pakistan was created? So if 1/3 of your population has come to India, then you must give us 1/3 of your population, of your country, 1/3 of your area to us. And if they don't, we should take it. If you look at the Bangladesh map and draw a line between Khulna and Sylhet, and all the portion above it is 1/3. Now these are some of the retaliatory steps which will create a good impression that you are ready to fight for your fundamental rights, for your rights, your security, and so on. If you don't retaliate, what is the use of being Sanskrit, adept in Sanskrit or becoming united? It's not enough. We must have that sting power, the retaliatory power, and these have to be developed. And there are ways to do it. I've given you some very stark ways of doing it, but there are more sophisticated ways of doing it. So, most of you here can assist us in this process in India by not being away from the political process of the United States. Now, of course, I'm happy to see, compared to when I first came to this country, a lot of Indians have got into the political process, but many more need to do. I've seen some of these organizations like the HAF working closely with Congress. Then there are some groups in Chicago which work with the Republican Party. So I think that in the process to fight for the rights of Hindus around the world, religious freedom is something for which the Americans have created a commission. So through that, you should be able to fight for the rights of the Hindus by entering the process. So the community, everybody need not enter, but you can encourage people, youngsters who want to deal with the work as understudies of the congressmen, or want to form NGOs. So the community should encourage such people, and in this process we will also be benefited, because your voice in the Congress, your voice in the government, your voice in the media will go a long way to help the Hindus to recover their self-respect, which is being under erosion for a long time. And that erosion has taken place not because of other people's ability to do it, but it's more because of our passivity, our readiness to take things lying down that is responsible. That mindset change has to take place, and that can be only done by a vigorous, what I call as the Virat Hindutva. People get frightened by the word Hindutva. Hindutva means only Hindu-ness. And what is Hindu-ness? Hindu-ness is the way we are different from others. We respect our elders. Do they respect elders in this country? I doubt it. Or very minimally. Some people may, but not generally. We have a totally different relationship between our family. If somebody suffers in our family, if a mother and father wants to come and live with us, we welcome it. But in this country, it's a nuclear family. It's something which so there are many aspects of our cultural system which we call as Hindu-ness. And that Virat means, of course, well, for lack of a better word, I'll say aggressive. Virat means the power to retaliate. And we must imbibe in ourselves a Virat Hindutva. I'll say this, that when I meet Americans in the ashram of Sri Ravi Shankar, or Swami Dayanand Saraswati, or Baba Ramdev, and I find them all very, very well-to-do in the United States of America. I ask them, why are you come? And they say, we are come to seek happiness. Now, why is it that they want to seek happiness here? It's because they thought that a one-dimensional pursuit of materialism or material welfare will produce happiness. But it doesn't. And that's why the Hindutva or Hindu ethos is that you make material progress, but it should be accompanied and harmonized with spiritual values. Why is it that our top leaders can be almost undressed and still we follow them? That's why the first question asked to me when I came as a student at Harvard from an American is, how you people followed Mahatma Gandhi? He's not even properly dressed. In the United States, you have to be properly dressed. I mean, I was told that Nixon lost one debate to Kennedy because he didn't shave properly. He had an evening shadow on his face and he didn't look good enough, and therefore he lost. Now, Obama is so well dressed, but you found Mahatma Gandhi just had one piece of cloth. And the same thing with religious leaders. Our religious leaders have one color cloth, the Bhagwa cloth, and that's it. Whereas the Pope is in satin gown with all kinds of jewels, around his neck. It's a totally different. The Mufti in Makkah is also the same way. We have never thought that money, wealth is the determinant of your social status. And we always thought that people with money would be respected in society if they, after meeting their needs, they donate the rest to the society, philanthropy. And that is why I think the happiness that even the poorest Indian, you can see even the poorest Indian is happier than the richest American. And that's because he is not driven by this material prosperity alone. He also values certain spiritual values. So all these factors are something which makes us unique. It's worth defending it, and for defending it, the power is within us. This is not a government's job. You can do it. Like learning Sanskrit, you can do it. By regarding all Indians as one, you can do it. You may have Gujarati Association, Marathi Association, but all of you go to every one of them. Why should you only Marathis go or Bengalis go? And create this, the national identity, and for which unity can come. Thank you very much.